What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and a few days ago we finally got the nominees for the 2023 Game Awards. And as I did last year, I'm going to go through the categories and tell you who I think should win. So without further ado, let's rock. So two quick disclaimers before we get started. So I do play a lot of video games, but I also have a full-time job and a family I like to hang out with every so often. So it's physically impossible for me to play all of these games. So there are going to be categories where I haven't really played that many of the games. And second, I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, but there are categories like the esports stuff and the content creator stuff that I'm not super interested in, and I'm not well versed in those categories. So this video is kind of just an excuse for me to talk about these games. I review a lot of these games, but I don't get to everything that I play throughout the year. So it's kind of just an excuse for me to talk about these games. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if I waste time on categories that I don't really know what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to waste any of your time BSing through those categories. So I'm going to kind of bury the lead with this video on purpose. I'm going to kind of build towards game of the year. So we're going to kind of start at the bottom and work our way up. So we're gonna start with what I think is kind of the silliest category of all these different categories, and that is most anticipated game. I'm not sure how you're supposed to quantify being more anticipated or less anticipated for a game that you haven't played yet. So it just kind of feels like a filler category for these big franchises to kind of showcase their upcoming games. I will mention, as I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, that I play a lot of games, but I don't play everything. And unfortunately, the original Hades was a game that slipped through the cracks for me. And it's just kind of a coincidence that I do this Nerd Year's resolution where I pick like 4 or 5 games every year from my ever-growing backlog of games that slip through the cracks. And Hades just happens to be one of the games I picked for this year, and I actually started it like a week ago. I've been playing it on my Steam Deck while I've been rewatching Better Call Saul, and I've really enjoyed it. I'm not usually a fan of the top-down type of style, but I've been really enjoying Hades, which shouldn't come as a surprise. A lot of people love that game when it first came out. Again, it kind of just slipped through the cracks for me. That being said, I'm not a huge fan of most of these franchises. So for me, it's either Hades 2 or Star Wars Outlaws. I'm a huge fan of Star Wars, and I've really enjoyed the Fallen Order, Jedi Survivor games, and I'm assuming it's going to be Star Wars Outlaws. It's going to be very similar. So that's going to ultimately be my vote. If I had played Hades, the original Hades, a little bit earlier, maybe that becomes my vote. But again, this category, it doesn't really matter all that much. The next category I want to talk about is best adaptation. We don't have to go too long with this particular category because it's not actually a video game category, but I am obsessed with TV and movies as well as video games. And while, of course, the video game adaptation genre has historically been very bad, I do think that it's getting a lot better. Now, I've only actually seen 2 of these, The Last of Us and the Super Mario Bros. Movie. I had a ticket for Gran Turismo, but unfortunately something came up the night I was planning on seeing it, and I just never circled back to it. And my free trial for Peacock ran out before I could watch Twisted Meadows. So I haven't seen either of those. I'm not a big Castlevania fan, so I was never going to watch that. But Super Mario Bros. Film was really fun. It was really cute, funny. I think that if Jack Black isn't nominated for an Oscar for the Peaches song, we should riot. But the choice for this is pretty easy for me. It's The Last of Us. It's one of my favorite video games of all time. And one thing that I love about that game is the story. And I think it's a perfect type of story to adapt to a TV show. But what's also great about it is they left some characters like Bill kind of open-ended in the game. And the TV show was able to really flesh out that character and other characters. They also gave some groups some backstory. They added some characters. So one of my favorite games of all time. And to be honest with you, I think it's the best video game adaptation we've ever gotten. All right, so best multiplayer. I've actually only played one of these games, and it's probably not the game that you think. I'm a big Magic, D&D, fantasy guy, but unfortunately, when Baldur's Gate 3 came out, I was playing something else. I don't remember whatever game it was when that came out. And I knew I was going to get sucked into this game, so I wanted to wait until I had a little bit of a gap. And I actually have been doing this for 4 or 5 years now. I usually take vacation in between Christmas and New Year, so I end up having like 2 weeks off, and I always play one of these big games that slip through the cracks for me, and this year is Baldur's Gate 3. I'm really psyched to play it, but I haven't played it yet. Despite not having played it yet, I do think that it's going to clean up in this award show. I have not heard a single person say a single negative thing about it. So despite not having played it, I do think that it's going to clean up. The game that I actually have played in this category is actually a game I don't think should be nominated in this category, and that's Super Mario Bros. Wonder. And I'm only saying that, don't get me wrong, I think it's a phenomenal game. My wife and I love playing these games co-op together. So you would think, oh, well, best multiplayer, co-op, you love this game, right? Not so fast. So this game actually came out when I was on a work trip, and my wife and I planned on playing it together. So we just would FaceTime every night and play this game. And the online co-op is really weird. It's basically you look like a little ghost to the other person you're playing with, and you don't really get to interact with each other. You're just playing the game at the same time. That's it. You don't really interact with each other at all. So it's not that much fun. So we played it a couple of nights when I was out of town, and then we were just like, okay, let's play something else because this isn't doing it for us. Now, when I got home, we played the couch co-op, and that's a lot of fun. But the online multiplayer is just, it doesn't do it for me. So I think that despite not playing the game, my vote is going to actually go to Baldur's Gate 3. I know it's kind of weird, but it's my vote, and I'm going to give it to Baldur's Gate 3, even though I haven't actually played the game yet. So I am going to skip a few categories. I'm actually going to be pretty quick with best fighting category because I've only actually played one of these games, and I promise you that's not going to be a trend. There's going to be some categories here coming up that I played like all the games. But despite really enjoying the All-Star Brawl, the first game, I'm a big fan of Ninja Turtles, as you could probably tell. And I love that they're in a like Smash Bros type of game. I have not played All-Star Brawl 2 yet, which isn't super surprising. I think it just came out like last week or 2 weeks ago. So it hasn't been out for very long. The only game that I've played, and if you're a long time watcher of this channel, you know, it's Mortal Kombat 1. I grew up on this franchise. I reviewed this game when it first came out, and despite not having a crypt and despite not having stage interactions, I do think that is a really awesome installment in one of my favorite franchises of all time. It just now had its season 2 and its Omni-Man DLC, so I'm definitely excited to circle back to it. I haven't got a chance to do season 2 yet, but I definitely plan on it here shortly. So best RPG, I think that it pretty much has to go to Baldur's Gate 3, even though I haven't played it. It's what you think of when you think of a RPG. I wouldn't, if I had to pick like a dark horse, I wouldn't be surprised if Final Fantasy 16 wins it. It's a big franchise. That game was well received. I didn't play it, but I heard great things about it. I am very surprised that Lies of P was nominated in this category. It's a great game. I really enjoyed it. I talked about it on a previous video, but I don't think of it as an RPG. The game, the big glaring snub in this category that I think you should have just taken Lies of P out and thrown Tears of the Kingdom in there. If Lies of P qualifies as an RPG, Tears of the Kingdom definitely qualifies as an RPG, and it's one of the best games of the year. So I don't know why you don't put it in as best RPG when, sort of spoiler alert, it's nominated for Game of the Year. How is it nominated for Game of the Year and not RPG? That just doesn't make any sense to me. But as far as the category as it currently stands, I think it's Baldur's Gate 3. So action adventure is a huge category for me because Outside of one exception, I've played all of these games. And honestly, there's two big games that you're gonna hear me talk about a lot on this video because they're nominated for a lot. We've already talked about Baldur's Gate 3, that's one of them. But Alan Wake 2, I've also not played. They're both games that I plan by the end of the year to have played. I just haven't played them yet. And of course, they're nominated for a lot of big categories, so I'm gonna have to constantly bring up the fact that I haven't played them. But outside of that, I've played all the rest of the games. I actually, in one way or the other, reviewed all of these games on this channel. So if you want my in-depth thoughts on each one of these games, Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4, Jedi Survivor, and Tears of the Kingdom, check out those videos. But I'm gonna kind of spoil the game of the year discussion that we'll have later. My personal favorite game that I have played, I don't think it'll win, and it's just a personal thing because I love Spider-Man so much. My favorite game that I played this year was Marvel's Spider-Man 2. So it is going to be my personal choice for game of the year. I don't think it will actually win. I actually don't think that it'll win this category. I think it'll be Tears of the Kingdom, which again, I loved that game. It should have been nominated for the category we just talked about. But if I'm voting for what I would pick personally, it would be Spider-Man 2. I loved Resident Evil 4 Remake. I do think it's a bit of a slippery slope for a remake to be nominated in a lot of these categories because video game remakes are not gonna stop happening. But if we start nominating them for a bunch of categories, it just kind of feels like it's a little cheap. Now, Resident Evil 4 Remake, it was from the ground up, but you still have a foundation there. So I do think it's a little weird that it's nominated. It's a great game. It's probably the game that I played and replayed the most this year. I bought it on my PC. It's Steam Deck verified, so I just played it constantly when it came out on my Steam Deck. I really enjoy that game. So don't get me wrong. I think it's a phenomenal game. The original was awesome, but I do think that they made that game even better. But I do think it's weird to nominate a remake for a bunch of categories. Jedi Survivor was a great game. Again, I'm a big Star Wars fan, but it did have some technical issues at launch, so I don't think that it should win. Tears of the Kingdom, if I'm voting for who I think will actually win, it's a phenomenal game. Yes, it doesn't look as good as some of these other games, but it's on an outdated console, so that shouldn't be held against it. It looks as good as you could possibly imagine on an outdated console. So I do think that Tears of the Kingdom is going to win, but if I'm voting with my heart, it's Spider-Man 2. All right, so we can be kind of quick with Best Action Game. I've actually only played two of these games, Dead Island 2 and Hi-Fi Rush. And while I did have fun with Dead Island 2, and we did have to wait a really long time, I do think it struggled a little bit in 2023, just because there's so many great games to play right now. I just think that despite being fun, it's an easily forgettable game in such a great year for gaming. Hi-Fi Rush, on the other hand, did really stick out to me as a game that I really enjoyed. It's so unique. It kind of has this comic book cartoon feel to it, and the rhythm combat is really cool. So if you're talking about best action game out of the two games that I've played, I think that Hi-Fi Rush is easily the best choice. Now, I will say that I did kind of struggle with this game just because I'm the typical white guy. I have trouble with rhythm, so I definitely struggled with this game a little bit, but it was an absolute blast to play. So I am going to combine both of the indie categories into this segment. I think that Cocoon should win both categories. It was a phenomenal puzzle platformer that I did review earlier this year, so definitely check out that video if you want my full thoughts, but I think it should win both categories. I wouldn't be surprised if Dave the Diver wins Best Independent Game. I know that it was really popular when it first came out. I will say, on the snubs side, I was kind of surprised, and maybe it's just because it technically doesn't qualify as an independent game, but it definitely plays like an independent game, and that's Planet of Nana. I really enjoyed that game. I do think that Cocoon is still a better puzzle platformer, but I was surprised that it wasn't nominated for either one of these categories because it was a really fun game. Again, maybe it doesn't technically qualify, but it definitely plays like an independent game. So technically, I don't even want to vote for best ongoing game just because that's not a genre that I really play. I do want to rant for a little bit the fact that Cyberpunk 2077 is even nominated in this category, because yes, I do want to applaud them for sticking with a broken game, but just because you released a game in an unplayable state and you stuck with it to eventually make it playable doesn't necessarily mean that it's an ongoing game. Yes, they just released the DLC, but a lot of games release DLC. That doesn't mean that it's an ongoing game. When I think of an ongoing game, I think of a multiplayer, free-to-play battle royale like Apex or Fortnite, which they're both nominated. So that's the type of game that I think of when I think of ongoing game. Cyberpunk does not qualify, because if you just released it in a state that was playable, you wouldn't be nominated for this category. I think that it's a shame that it's nominated and Halo Infinite isn't. That's the game that should be nominated for this category. So typically, best performance is one of my favorite categories to vote on. I love giving props to these great performers, and I don't think that video game performers get as much credit as they deserve. However, unfortunately, this year, I haven't played as many of these games. I've only played Jedi Survivor, even though he was awesome in that game. That game was a lot more character focused than I thought it was going to be going into it, so I thought he did a great job. I didn't play the Cyberpunk DLC, but if Idris Elba is in attendance, it wouldn't surprise me if they gave it to him, just because that would be a big get for the Game Awards, for him to do an award speech because he's such a famous actor. However, I don't know if that's even a consideration at all. But my personal pick, just because it's the only other game that I've played, is Yuri Lowenthal, which I don't know if I pronounced his last name right, so I apologize if I didn't. He was best known this year for his depiction of Peter Parker in Marvel Spider-Man 2. However, he does a lot of voices in a lot of different video games. I think he did several voices in Jedi Survivor as well. So he is a pro in the video game space, so I definitely want to give him credit. So that would be my vote for best performance, even though, again, for me personally, it's kind of a, I don't want to say a lackluster year just because they're all great performers, I'm sure. I just haven't played a lot of these games. Best audio design was surprisingly tough to pick, because in my heart, I love survival horror so much, and I do think that the audio design in survival horror is crucial, and there's a couple of really good survival horror games nominated in this category. I wanted to vote for them so bad, but I had to vote with my head, and my head tells me that Hi-Fi Rush has to be the choice for best audio design and technically best music as well. So I'm gonna kind of combine those two categories together. It's Hi-Fi Rush. The way that they were able to take music and the audio design and combine them with the combat, first of all, was so cool and probably took a ton of work. So for me, it's gotta be Hi-Fi Rush for both categories. So art direction is another tough category, and to be honest, the remaining categories are all tough because they're all great games nominated. And I just got done talking about the music of Hi-Fi Rush, but I do think the art direction is just as good. It basically felt like playing a comic book, and I grew up on comic books, so I was definitely a fan of that. I will say that just calling Liza P a Soulsborne clone, it's a bit reductive. I don't think it gives it as much credit as it deserves, because they really nailed the tone of those games. And despite shitting on the multiplayer of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, I did really enjoy that game. They went above and beyond with the art direction. They just kind of had fun with it, and I really enjoyed that game. But my personal pick would be Tears of the Kingdom. Yes, it does look a little bit outdated, but that's the Switch for you. That's not their fault. I do actually think that they deserve a lot of credit for creating this vibrant world on an outdated console without it crashing all the time. It just works, and I definitely want to give them credit for that. So if I had to choose, it would definitely be Tears of the Kingdom. Again, I haven't played Alan Wake 2 yet, but I have heard it's a really good survival horror game. As much as I enjoyed Spider-Man 2, again, Spoiler alert, it's going to be my personal pick for game of the year because it's the game that I enjoyed playing the most, which is saying a lot in a year like 2023 when there's a lot of great games. However, one of my small nitpicks for this game was the symbiote storyline, which of course is part of the narrative. It was pretty beat for beat with stuff that we've seen done with that storyline before. So I don't necessarily think that it should win Best Narrative. But unfortunately, it's the only game that I've played in this category. I do think that if I'm voting with my head, it's going to be Baldur's Gate 3. But I've only actually played Spider-Man 2 in this category. So I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it would not surprise me if Baldur's Gate 3 won Best Game Direction. It wouldn't surprise me if it won literally every single category that it's nominated for. That's how much positive stuff I've heard about this game. Again, Spider-Man 2 was my personal favorite game to play, but it wasn't that much different from the original game, which is good. That's what I want in my sequels. Give me what works in the first game and improve upon it a little bit. But I don't think it improved upon enough to really have a shot in winning in this category. Again, Super Mario Bros. Wonder was a lot of fun, so it would not surprise me if I had to pick a dark horse for this category. It might be that, but between Baldur's Gate 3 and Tears of the Kingdom, I'm personally going to vote for Tears of the Kingdom just because I've played that game and I haven't played Baldur's Gate 3. But if I'm voting for my head, I'm probably voting for Baldur's Gate 3. But since I've played Tears of the Kingdom, I'll go ahead and give it to that. The game is just so much fun. The fact that they were able to improve upon Breath of the Wild, unlike Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2, they really took what is one of the best games ever created and they improved upon it, which I didn't even think was possible. The fact that you could just build stuff now, they basically took some things that people were having fun with in Breath of the Wild. They were kind of makeshift making like boats and airplanes, and they were just like, oh, you like to do that? Here's an ability where you could just go absolute ape shit, and it's so much fun. I spent so much time building, so I definitely think that Tears of the Kingdom, again, wouldn't be surprised if Baldur's Gate 3 got it, but my vote is going to go for Tears of the Kingdom. So I know I've already spoiled about 100 times what my personal game of the year is, and that of course is Spider-Man 2. I just talked about it, but it did exactly what I wanted from a sequel. It took a game that I really loved. I'm a huge fan of Spider-Man. I grew up on Spider-Man comics, so I loved the original game. They took what worked in that original game and they improved upon it slightly. But if I'm being 100% honest and I'm speaking with my head and not my heart, I don't know if it necessarily stacks up with some of these other games like Alan Wake 2 and Baldur's Gate 3. Even though I haven't actually played those games, I've heard such amazing things about them that it would really surprise me if Spider-Man 2 beat out either one of those games. I think if I was voting with my head, it would be Baldur's Gate 3. I am a bit surprised. I already touched on this a little bit earlier with a previous category. I think it was Action Adventure. That I am surprised that Resident Evil 4 Remake was nominated for this category. Yes, it's a great game. I really enjoyed it. Like I said earlier, it's probably the game that I played and replayed the most in 2023. I had a great time playing this game on my Steam Deck, but yes, it's a true remake. It's not just a remaster. They built it from the ground up, but you are still reusing assets. You still have that foundation from a great game like the original RE4. So I am a bit surprised. I do think it's a slippery slope putting a remake in this category. I am also kind of surprised that Super Mario Bros. Wonder was nominated. It's a great game. It's really, really fun, but it's 2023. There's a lot of great games that came out this year. So to nominate RE4 Remake and Super Mario Bros. Wonder is really surprising, especially considering Tears of the Kingdom is also nominated. Because when I first saw these nominations, I was like, oh, Super Mario Bros. Wonder is just them trying to like throw a bone to the Nintendo fanboys. But Tears of the Kingdom is also nominated, so that's a little odd to me. Again, if I'm voting with my head, I think that it's probably Baldur's Gate 3, but the other game outside of Alan Wake 2, which I can't really talk about because I haven't played, that I think will have a legit shot in winning is Tears of the Kingdom. So I think I'm going to vote for Tears of the Kingdom just because even though I think Baldur's Gate 3 will win, I haven't actually played it yet. And I've played a lot of these other games. And so Tears of the Kingdom, if I'm voting with my head, would be my vote of the games that I've played. But again, my personal favorite is Spider-Man 2. But of course, those are just the games that were nominated for Game of the Year. But as there is in every year, especially in a great year like 2023, there are a lot of games that people are upset weren't nominated. I think the game that most people were surprised wasn't nominated was Starfield. I know the Xbox fanboys were really upset that wasn't nominated. And if you're going to nominate RE4 Remake, even though I enjoyed RE4 Remake more than Starfield, I get it. As far as a technical achievement, Starfield is a greater achievement than a remake like RE4 Remake. In a year like 2023, I'm not that surprised that Starfield wasn't nominated. Yeah, it was a fun game, but there's a lot of dialogue in that game, and the facial animations while you're watching somebody talk to you just wasn't that great. It looked outdated, especially the space exploration was a little weird. It was mostly just navigating menus and hitting buttons and watching cutscenes. So in a year like 2023, I actually wasn't that surprised it wasn't nominated. I'm personally not a fan of the Final Fantasy games. I'm sure they're fun. They have a great fan base, but I personally just never really got into them. But I am surprised that Final Fantasy 16 wasn't nominated. It was really well received and it's such a huge fan base. I'm surprised that they didn't at least give them a token nomination. I know it was nominated in other categories, but I was really surprised it wasn't nominated for Game of the Year. And lastly, I'm really surprised that there wasn't at least one indie game. It feels like the Game Awards always saves at least one nomination for Game of the Year for an indie game. And I appreciate that because I love those types of games. And for me, this year, it's clearly going to be Cocoon. Of course, it didn't get nominated. They didn't actually do the indie thing that they normally do. But if they had, it should have been Cocoon, at least in my opinion. But as always, this is just my thoughts on the Game Awards. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below, especially if you thought I missed a snub. It doesn't necessarily have to be for Game of the Year. It could be for any category. If you think I missed a snub, let me know in the comments down below. Of course, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, as the kids say. It's just a free and easy way to tell YouTube that you enjoyed this content, and they should push it to other people that might enjoy it as well. Of course, if you did enjoy the content, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. That way you get notified every time I post a new video. I try to post weekly gaming related content. So if you enjoy that type of content, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy. And we were just talking, and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?